All right, good people. Well, welcome back. I know that we have had a good amount of time so far to really start the process of getting used to all the work that we've been doing on the front end. And now it's a good amount of time for us to start um, really thinking about the back end and what we will need to create full stack applications that kind of run on both sides. So if you recall a few, at this point, it's probably been a few months since we have talked about it, but I want to refresh your memory on one particular aspect of um, the web dev landscape that we started talking about, but it's just important to just keep ourselves reminded about what's going to happen when we fully build out our own applications all the way in the near future. So I want to bring up this image. This one that I found actually doesn't look too clear, but hopefully it'll be all right, just to get the point across, which is this little image here. So just give me a quick thumbs up if you kind of vaguely remember an image that looked like this, right? On the left-hand side, you see a client-side computer, and on the right-hand side, you see the server kind of acting computer, right? The client computer is going to be making requests to the server computer. The server then responds to those requests with responses. I know this image is a little grainy, so I apologize about that. But give me a thumbs up if you vaguely remember this image from some of the things that we talked about toward the beginning of this bit of sessions, right? Yeah, what you're looking at here is what we call the client server model, which is basically the way that we work on the web to transfer data and really have the experience that we have when we go to particular websites. So if you think about it, we've been realistically thinking about the left-hand side of this relationship, thinking about client side programming. Everything we've been working on so far with React and building out these front end pages is realistically us getting to the place of having client side code. Toward the end of the semester and these sessions, we're going to be focusing a lot more on the server, right? And today we're going to actually start talking a little bit more about the server side of the programming landscape. But I want you to keep this image in mind as we start this process, because we will end up building applications that complete this entire life cycle of a client reaching out to a server, the server responding with something back to that client. And in order to do that, we've already kind of covered most of what we need on the left-hand side. We're going to start diving more into what we need on the right-hand side. So today we're going to build our first server using Node and Express and JavaScript so that we have the ability to create our own servers. And so if you're ready to rock with me on that tip, just give me a thumbs up so I know that you're here and you're ready to go, and we will make it happen. I know that a lot of folks have been waiting on this piece, so hopefully I can live up to the hype. All right, cool. So in order to do this, all you're going to need to follow along with me today is a VS Code window open. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a new VS Code window for myself. I encourage you to do the same. And then I will talk to you about the technology that we're going to use in order to build out the server side of our applications here. So let me just open this VS Code window. While that's opening, I'm going to just go ahead and go here so we can have a conversation about the technology we're going to be using to build out these servers. So great. So VS Code is open. So what technology are we going to be using? And realistically, I guess we should start with, well, what is a server, right? What is a server? Well, a server essentially is going to be a running computer application that allows for us to handle those client requests, right? So if I go back to that image that I just had up for a second, or find a different one, let's see, because I closed it. Essentially, right, if we look at the idea of of how servers work, right? The servers realistically only have one key function for us in the landscape that we're going to be talking about them. And that is the job of the server is to respond to our client requests. So a client machine on the left will be making a request to our server. The server is going to be listening for those requests and will respond with some data, right? So all the server is meant to do is be able to handle the requests that are coming in from particular clients and allow for us to respond with some data. So give me a quick thumbs up if that makes sense to you, right? The server that we got to build, in order for it to serve its function, we need it to be able to listen and hear client requests, right? These incoming requests, and it needs to be able to respond with some data, right? So that's our goal, right? And so there's a number of different ways that you can realistically build a server for yourself. You can build them with many different programming languages, but today we're going to be focusing on how do we build one using Node and Express and JavaScript. What we're going to be using today and we're going to play with is Express, which is a Node package that allows for us to create and manage the creation of our servers using JavaScript. Express is a very popular library in JavaScript. So you'll find that the documentation, if you go to expressjs.com, is very helpful in terms of getting started. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to follow the guide here and get started with building our first server. I'm going to talk you through it, explain some of the code so that you're aware of what's going on there. And then we'll talk about where we got to go from here. So again, if you're ready to rock with me, all you need open right now is a VS Code window and you should be good to go. Yeah, just give me a thumbs up and let's keep it going. Awesome. Thank y'all. Appreciate that. And I know that I just jumped in, like, I mean, I jumped in like I wasn't really thinking about y'all at all. How are y'all feeling? In the chat, drop a 1 to 5, if you're feeling good. If you're not feeling good, how are you today? Sorry about that, you know what I'm saying? We just went straight down to business like Mulan, you know what I'm saying? All right, that's lit. Y'all lit. Dang. Thanksgiving was lit. Hey, that's fire. All right. Glad to hear that. Glad to hear that. All right, well, let's keep the vibes going then. Appreciate y'all for being here. Cool. So we're going to use Express to build out our first server-side application. And it's going to be fairly simple. Again, the goal will be to just use the documentation to help us understand what we're doing. I'll make sense of some of the code for folks that might not be familiar with Express or any server-side framework altogether. We'll talk through that, and then we'll talk about, well, what could we do to make these server-side pieces of code a little bit more robust? So to do that, I'm going to just follow through the guide. And JavaScript applications are really cool because they'll tell you real quickly, like, here's what you got to do to get started. And we're going to be using NPM and Node. So in order to follow along with what I'm doing, you got to have Node or an NPM installed onto your machine. For those of y'all who are rocking with me, been here for a minute, I already know that you do got that. But just remember that anytime you see a command that says NPM install something, that means that you need to have NPM installed on your machine, which you can do very easily if you download Node on your machine as well. And the Node website, I think, is linked right here. It's nodejs.org if you wanted to make sure you had the latest version of Node and NPM on your machine. All right. Well, with that being said, starting a server in Express is very simple, right? The first step is for us to install Express, but realistically, we don't even have a project to install this into yet. So we're going to actually set up a new Node project and use that project so that we can install Express. Now, there's a couple of different ways we could do this, but I find that it'll be helpful for y'all to see it in kind of step-by-step perspective. So let's say, for instance, you've opened up a new VS Code window, and I'm going to just share my screen at this point so you can see, right? Let's say that you're just getting started. You have a new VS Code window open, and you're getting ready to work on this project, right? Well, we don't realistically have a place to work in yet. So I like to create folders, right? To just make sure that I'm holding my code in a specific place. Now, here's where it gets important that we kind of follow along in a similar process, right? So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a folder for all of this server side code that I might be working on in the next couple of weeks, right? To do that, I'm going to just click open right here, or at the top, I can say file, open folder. What that will allow me to do is define a folder where I can start to do this work. I don't think it shows y'all the pop-up that I see with all my files and folder stuff. But what popped up is a folder, my main folder on my computer, and all of the different folders inside of there. In that folder, I have already a projects folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and navigate into that folder. And then inside of that folder, I'm just going to create a new folder. And so on the bottom, I have an option to create a new folder. I'm going to call this server side, just so that I have a new folder with the options to save some stuff in here. So in this folder, I'm going to just say open, and I should have a new project open up in VS Code. And you'll see that it opens up like this, where you on the left-hand side, you have a folder representing that particular folder you're in. The reason that I do this, opening the folders, is just because the next step is I want to open a terminal window inside of this particular folder. So go ahead, open a folder however you like, but make sure that you can navigate to that folder in the terminal. And if you're at that point, just raise your hand so I know that you're rocking with me. You could follow the way I did it, or you could do it your way. The goal is to just have a folder open in VS Code where you're going to be comfortable with writing a bunch of new code inside. Cool. I'll do a quick pause for the folks. I see folks are going ahead, opening up their folders. Appreciate y'all. That's what's up. Cool. And then I'll just reshare. So we're focusing on this VS Code window. And we will keep it pushing. All right, fam. So I'll give it one more minute, and we'll see in a second a little bit of what we got to do here to get this popping. Awesome. Appreciate those of y'all raising your hands just to know how many folks are kind of following along is great. So yeah, I appreciate y'all for keeping me in that loop. Cool. So here's what we got to do. So now that we have this folder open, right, we're going to go ahead and start a new node project inside of this folder. So to do that, what we're going to do is in the terminal, right, you should be in the folder for your project, and the terminal should be tied to that particular folder. Again, you'll know that that's the case if you see a match on the left-hand side, this bit of text here where my cursor is moving, and the text inside the terminal should match. And that basically says, I'm looking at the folder that I have open right now. The best way to do that is just open the folder directly on VS Code, but you have to create the folder then to open the folder. And we all have our own different workflows for how we do that. Either way, what we need to do now is we need to create a new, to make sure that this project knows that it's a node-based project. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the npm command in a way that I don't think we've used so far. The npm command, the node package management command, npm, is a command that we use is a versatile command that we use for a lot of different things with our projects, right? We've used it to install packages, we've used it to run commands, etc. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to initialize a new, we're going to initialize this folder to leverage the node package manager and node in general. To do that, we're just going to say npm space init. And npm init is a command that is going to allow for us to create a new project and a new package.json file inside of this particular folder that we opened. So when you run that command, you'll see it gives you a little bit of text, says, hey, this utility is going to walk you through creating a package.json file. Most of the default keys are going to just be what we're going to use, but we'll talk about it in a second, what each thing is doing. So it says, hey, once you've done this, once you've created this package.json file, then you'll be able to do things like run npm help for other command information, but more specifically, we'll be able to do npm install in order to install packages and save it as a dependency, right? So if you recall, when we are going to be working with different external libraries, we use npm install blah, 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 right? But in order to do npm install blah, blah, blah anywhere, we need to make sure we have a package.json file. So we need to do this command npm init in order to make that file. So once you run that command, you'll see that there's the cursor's kind of hanging. It's waiting for us to add some information to each of these lines that it's going to ask us. So the first line it asks is the package name. Right now, it's going to just use the default name of the folder. So that's cool. I'm going to press enter to go to the next. It's going to ask me what version number is this folder of code. I can say version 1. That's fine. I'm going to press enter again. It's going to ask me for a description. I could put a description here and say something like our first Express app, right? When I'm done, or I could leave it blank. It's up to you. Press enter. The entry point, this is important, but we can leave it as it currently is. The idea is that so the idea here is asking us now, what is going to be the name of the main file that we're going to run in this project, the main JavaScript file? It can be called anything, but it has to end with a .js. So here we're saying index.js. We could, if I had a different name and I wanted it to be like main.js, I could do that. If I wanted it to be app.js, I could do that. But if I leave it as index.js, that's fine. I just can press enter here to keep going. Test command, if there was a particular command that I wanted to use to run my tests, I could put that here. Since I don't have one yet, I'm just going to press enter. Get repository, I don't have right now. Press enter. Keywords, again, press enter. Author, enter. License, enter, and we're good, right? We're going to have our at least the default information for our package.json. It's going to ask me if this is okay. I'm just going to type yes, and boom. The next thing you'll see is on the left-hand side, you'll have a package.json created for you. When you click on that, you should be familiar with what this file looks like from some of our work on the front end with React and whatnot. We have just a simple JSON with some information on the project, right? The name, the description that I typed up, what is the name of the main file that we're going to be running is index.js, and some scripts. I didn't specify test script, so that's fine. But if I wanted to add more scripts, I could do that in here as well. The author, I could put myself as the author. License, licensing is all about how is the code attributed? Like, if somebody can somebody use this code? Is it open source, etc. So right now we have a very simple package.json. So go ahead, run npm init in your folder, create your package.json file, and when you're done, just give me a hand wave or something. Raise your hand, I should say, because that would be the best way to know that everybody's here. Essentially, all we wanted to do is create this package.json file so that we can then install our own packages. Again, to do that, all you got to do is run the command npm init inside of your folder, and you can just use all of the defaults. A helpful thing to know is if you want to skip doing this whole utility thing, you can do npm space init space -y, like this, npm init -y, to just kind of go ahead and say, hey, give me all the defaults, and that's it. But once you have a package.json file, you're good to go. So just raise your hand when you're at that point, and we'll keep it pushing. You can skip anything that you don't know. So if you're like, hey, they're asking for a Git repo, I don't have one, just press enter. It's okay. You can always add it to your package.json file later. So it's not a big deal. Cool. Appreciate those of y'all raising your hands. It's good to know that you're rocking with me there. So I'll give it one more minute and then we'll keep it pushing. Awesome. Couple more seconds and we should be good. All right, y'all. Awesome. So thank y'all so much for following along. So let's keep it pushing. So first step, we needed to install npm and get a node in our folder. That allows us now. We basically, if you think about it this way, what we just did was we created a new node project, right? A project, like I told y'all before, we know a project is a node-based project if inside of the folder that we're looking at for the code, we have a package.json file. Without the package.json file, we couldn't run this with Node. So our first step was create a Node project, and we did that by creating this package.json. The next step in our server-side journey is actually creating our server and using Express to do that. But now that we have a package.json file, we can do the next step, which is installing Express so that we can use it in our code. So the next command that you're going to have to do in the terminal is run npm install express, just like you see on the bottom here. Actually, let me just clear the terminal so it's a little easier. See, npm install express, right? And so this command, when you press enter, will go ahead and use npm to find the express package in library and install it to your machine. Install it into your project, I should say. That process of installing anything using npm is going to also change our folder structure by creating two new pieces of information. One is the package.lock.json, which just keeps an up-to-date record of the latest versions of the packages that we've installed. And then the node modules folder, which is where all of those particular pieces of code are being housed. So with Express, as you can see, it says it had to add 62 packages in order to allow for us to use Express. So Express itself relied on that many packages. Those packages are housed inside of our node modules folder here. So your folder structure should look a little bit like this, right? You have your main folder, you have the package.json that we created using the npm init command, and you should have, after running npm install express, you should have a node modules folder in there, a package-lock.json, and you'll know that things worked out well if in the package.json, you scroll down and you should see something that says dependencies, and Express should be listed as a dependency inside of your package.json file as well. This is how you'll be able to guarantee to verify, hey, did I install any packages, or is this node project using any packages, right? Now we know, hey, this project is dependent on using Express, right? So go ahead, knock that out for yourselves. Again, what you have to do is run npm install express like so. And when you run npm install express, you should have those changes. Just give me a quick raise of your hand so I know that you got that and we're ready to go. The fun part comes next, I guarantee you. And again, if you're experiencing any trouble or you're having any questions, please drop them in the chat so myself or anybody else in the group can help so that we can all build out this little server. Cool. I'll wait right till the top of the hour, which it looks like it just happened. So boom, let's keep it pushing and build out this little server for ourselves. All right, y'all. So we did everything. These two steps are all we really need to get started building out our server. We needed the node so that we could run node in our project file, and we just installed Express. So now we should be able to actually create our server. So how you start your node projects is important in the fact that it's going to always ask you, well, what is the main point of entry file for this project, right? So the main point of entry file for this project, we specified it to be index.js. Again, we could have specified this to be app.js. We could have specified this to say server.js. We could have had this be anything, right? In this case, I just set it to the default, which is index.js. All that means is that if I'm to follow what I put in my package.json, I should create an index.js file to be my main JavaScript file that I'm going to be working with next. The package.json file, again, the main point of entry file is going to always kind of say, hey, what file should we look for first, right? And in the case of whether it's a server-side app or a client-side app, you just want that to be consistent. So because I said here it'd be called index.js, I just want to make sure I have an index.js file also created there. So I just really quickly created that new file, named it index.js, and now you're seeing my blank file with nothing inside of it. So the next step is for us to actually write out the code to create our server. And so we'll do this in steps. So I'll start by writing the code out, and from there, then I'll explain a little bit of what's going on, and we will I'll give you some time to run that on your side as well. So first things first, the first thing I got to do in order to build out this particular server for myself is I need to, inside of this JavaScript file, I need to bring Express into the project. Now, to do that, I'm going to just write the syntax first, and then we're going to talk about it. So first is const express gets require, and then inside of that require, I'm just going to write express. So what you're looking at here is an import. I'm importing import express, right, into our project. So this line, right, line 2 now, const express gets require express, is an import of a particular package from our node modules. Now, if you remember, when we were doing imports and exports in the client side, this looked a little different, right? Before it was something like, import, it would be something like import express from like express or something like this, right? There's two different ways of importing and exporting files in Java. Well, there's two different ways of importing files in JavaScript, I should say. On the client side, you're going to see a lot of folks using this import from syntax, right? In the server side, you're going to need to use the require syntax. The reason why is comes down to how node projects on the server side are using modules versus client side projects, how they use node modules. So just want you to know that on the server side, which we're working in right now on the server side, when we import things from node modules, right, particularly, we're going to need to make sure we use this const require syntax, which is a little bit different than the import export stuff we might be used to. So first step is import express into our project. The next step is we need to create a running application for our server. So all servers realistically need to do two things. So I'm just going to put a comment here so y'all can see that as I say this. Our server needs to listen for client requests and respond with data. So in order to do this, right, in order to listen for client requests and respond to those requests with some data, we need like an application. We need something that's running in order to do this, right? So we need to build an app. The app itself we're going to use Express to do it. So grateful for us. We don't have to build this all from scratch, but we will need to create an app. So the next step you're going to see is I'm going to write and create a new application that is going to be using Express to instantiate itself. So Express here is a function. You can see it creates an Express application. The Express function is a top level function exported by the Express module, blah, blah, blah. So we needed to bring the Express module in to get access to this Express function. So what this line is doing, line 2, is saying, hey, I'm creating a new variable called Express that is realistically going to be whatever comes out of this export, which is, or this import, which is importing from the Express library. The way that the developers behind Express made it was that Express itself is a function. So we can call that function later and create another variable that will represent an application that is going to be running Express. So step 2 is to create a new Express application. So I'm going to pause right quick so that y'all can catch up. Go ahead and bring in these 2 first steps, right? Import Express into your JavaScript file and create your application. And once you're done, just like it looks like y'all did, raise your hands. Appreciate that. It will keep it rocking. Again, I'm just going to pause just so folks have some time to get on this. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat. But yeah, all we did was create this first step of bringing in the Express module and saving it to a variable called Express, and then using that variable, which is a function, to create a new variable called app. Cool, I'll give it like 20 more seconds. Keep it pushing. Awesome. Cool. So we have the first step in realistically in getting this server running, which is we have a running application for Express that's going to be created in this code. The next step that we need is for this server to create some information for us to run our server, right? So our next goal is to define server information, essentially, right? So to do this, we're going to have to create a couple different pieces of information. The first and most important piece is to define what port is our server going to run on our local machine. So every server application is going to be running on a particular machine. A machine has its own IP address, right? But to define the running instance of the application for our server, we need to give it a particular port to run on our machine. So to do that, we're going to just define a new variable called port. And I'm going to set it right now to 3000, which should feel a little bit familiar. I think when we were using Veet, they were creating servers on like port 5143 or something like this. What we're trying to do is create running instance of our server on a particular port in our machine. So if you remember, when some of these servers we've been working with were running, we'd see things like localhost colon 3000, localhost colon 5143 or 5134 or whatever, right? That information is the port, right? What port of our machine, the colon, blah, 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 is this particular server running on? In the networking space, we use ports so that a machine can run multiple servers at different points in time using multiple ports. So it's important to give your port a unique number that another port isn't currently using. 3000 is a safe one. 4000, I've seen, 8000, there's a lot of different open ports. You'll know if a port is open or not if you run it and then something tells you, hey, this port is in use or something like that. So we can go with 3000 for now because I know it's a safe bet. Chances are you don't have anything running on port 3000 right now. And if you did, we could always change this to 3001 or 3003 or something like that. The next thing that we want to do is we want to create a route for our server. So I'm going to change this comment from define server information because I want to be specific. Define server port. And then the next step is create our first route. So all servers are going to need to do this particular thing, right? Listen for the client request and respond with data. So to listen to a client request, we have to create what we call a route. A route is going to basically handle listening for a particular request to our server, and with that request that came in, respond, right? It gives us an opportunity to listen to that request and respond. A route is defined by a couple characteristics. I'm going to write one, very simple one, and then we'll talk about those characteristics so you can see it while we talk about it. So the first route we're going to create is going to be a very simple route. It's going to say app.get. And again, I'll break down what we're seeing here in a second. We're going to say / or backslash. I always forget which one this is. I ain't gonna cap. But you're gonna say app.get / right? And then we're gonna have a function that we're gonna pass in here. And it's really helpful to just use an arrow function in here. So I'm just gonna go ahead and define the arrow function. So remember, an arrow function is essentially just a function syntax in JavaScript that allows us to write a single line function in a way. This function could take in parameters, right? So I could have, param1, param2, etc. inside of this parentheses. And then inside of these curly braces is where I can write the body of my function, right? So typically you'll see people enter like so, but here again, highlighted is the function, right? The param1 and param2 in this case will be very specific because when we're working with our server, we are using Express to pass in particular parameters into this function. And again, I'll explain everything once we finish the main syntax. So param1 in this case, we're going to just call it rec for right now, REQ. And param2, we're going to say res. So rec and res, right? And these two params are going to represent our client request, right? And an object that we can use for our responses to send back some data. So the only thing I need to do in this case is just so that we have something that we can use to run and see it working is I'm going to send back some data for right now. So I'm going to just say res.send, and I'm going to say, hello world, we're live on our first server. Cool. So this all together is a route in the server side, right? So let's break down a little bit of what we're looking at here. So you see this app.get, right? Well, app, remember, is a variable that we defined earlier. It's the variable holding our running Express application, right? So if I had named this particular variable something different, I would make sure that I have this down here named something different as well, right? So the app is realistically our running express instance. The app we can see is an object because the app has the ability for us to use the dot syntax, and the dot syntax has a number of different parameters on there. So if I go on another line just to show you, if I type app dot now, right, here are some of the other parameters that we could use, right? So a couple different properties and a couple different functions. We ended up using the app.get function, right? So app.get, I wonder if folks are thinking about where this is coming from, right? You see .get. If we scroll down, I'm gonna show you one more thing, app.post, right? We got another thing. If we keep going, app.put. Above here, we saw something like app.delete. I wonder if anybody recalls what those particular four keywords, what is significant about them. Delete, put, get, post, right? If those things are sounding familiar, they should, because what they are representing are our HTTP methods. So if you recall, right, when we first started talking about servers, clients, etc., we were talking about them from the context of HTTP, right? And HTTP as a protocol for transferring data across the web, right? All of those particular, all HTTP requests fall under a set of categories. There's a couple different what we call HTTP methods that we use to transfer data, right? So recall there's 4 HTTP methods: get, post, I should put them all caps, get, post, put is another one, delete is another one. And there's some other ones, but these are the most important ones for you right now. Get, post, put, delete. The HTTP methods, again, these are just specified methods that a client can say, hey, I'm going to call this particular HTTP method so I can request a specific type of data, right? Give me a thumbs up if you remember that from when we first started talking about HTTP. I remember in my slides, I showed it off. I don't know if I have that image. That was the image I was looking for earlier, but I was like, oh, it's going to take me a second to find that, John. But okay, cool. I see some folks talking about it. Yeah. So the 4 those HTTP methods are essentially the client's way of saying, hey, I have a specific type of request that I want to make. And maybe I can pull up a little diagram that can break this down a little bit easier, just so that we're familiar. Let's see, Google Images. Let us see. Yeah, okay, there we go. This will be good. Let me use this. So open imaging tab. Sorry, y'all. So the significance of these HTTP methods, right, is in the fact that we use these HTTP methods to do certain things from the client's perspective, right? So when the client says, hey, I'm going to make a request to a server, right, it always will put into the request some information that tells the server what type of requests are you making, right? These are the types of requests that they can make. One request is a GET request. A GET request is a client saying, hey, I'd like to read some data from the server. The server looks at a GET request and says, okay, that makes sense. I will take your request and give you back some data, right? The POST method says, hey, as a client, I would like to insert some data, right? I have data that I'm going to pass into you, and I'd like to post that data to you so that you can do something with it on the server. I'd like to insert some data. Put and patch is used when you're updating data, so it's similar to a post method in that you're passing data but I guess like the significance of it is a little different. You're saying, hey, you know, I'm updating data that already exists. Then the delete request is saying, hey, I'd like to delete data. Now, these aren't set in stone requests, right? So in the way that how should I describe this? In the way that like you don't need to always use a delete request if you want to delete data from your server, for instance. You don't always have to use a put request if you want to update data on your server. It's just that these methods are tied to, that's kind of the colloquial meaning of them when you see them being used. The two most important methods that you got to be familiar with are the first two, a GET request and a POST request. Basically, the fundamental difference between the two is with a GET request, and we'll see this in a second, a client just says, hey, I'll have a request, and that's it. With a POST request, client has to specify some data. It passes some data in, right? So typically GET requests are used when you want to read data and just get some data back without having to put data in. A POST request, on the other hand, is always going to be used with a request where a client is sending some data with the request itself. Again, we'll take a look more into some of those more significant methods over time. But for now, let's go back to our VS Code window and talk about this particular request that we built. So this route that we built, right, app.get. So essentially we're saying, hey, Express, we're creating a new route that's going to be for a GET request. A GET request, again, is when a client is reaching out to us and saying, hey, I'd like to read some data, right? Now, the next thing that we're specifying is the path that route is going to take in. So the route itself will have to come from a particular path, right? In our case, the path will be, if our server is running at port 3000, right? This path is saying, hey, if somebody went to localhost 3000, you know, if they went to localhost 3000 or they went to localhost 3000 slash like just slash, these two routes correspond to this particular path. This is the root path. This path is the path that comes up naturally if you typed in the you know, just the regular kind of IP address or the domain name. Or it's the same thing as if there was a slash but nothing behind it, right? This is the root route, right? When we create our server and our routes, we can create routes for any number of paths, right? So let's say I have a different GET request, and I'm just going to write this one here. So I'm going to say slash test, right? This route will be triggered if the and let me just finish the function up. This route will be triggered if the path that a user types in is if a user types in localhost 3000 slash test, right? So localhost 3000 slash test will trigger this particular route, whereas the regular kind of just typing localhost 3000 will trigger our regular root route. So that's what the path signifies. Is what is the kind of URL that is going to be used in order to reach this particular route. Lastly, we have a function, right? And the function, I started explaining a little bit. This function is realistically kind of think about it like when a client comes with a GET request to this route, what happens? This function is what happens, right? So what this function is defining here is it gives us Express passes in two objects for us to use in that function. One object is the request object, which would come back with some more information from the client on the particular request. Again, with GET requests, there isn't typically a need to pass more information through the request object. But with other types of requests like POST requests, you might need to look for some of the data that a client is sending in that request object. So a client will send data through the request object, and we can use that request object to then, you know, do all types of stuff and get back information from that particular client side request. And again, we'll talk about some more examples in a second. The second piece of data that comes back into our Express function is the response object. So Express has both a request and a response object basically built for us to use in our function. The response object, as you can see clearly, allows for us to do things like send some data. So the send method sends a response of data to back to the client, right? So as you can see, here are some examples. We could send a whole new data object. We could send a JSON. We could send HTML back, or we could send a string of text with a particular status method as well, right? So a response object, realistically, these two things stand for request and response. And you can have them say however you'd like. Sometimes you'll see people keep theirs to say request and response. A lot of times you'll see people use the shorthand of rec and res. It doesn't, the naming of it doesn't matter, but just know that in this express function, because we're using express, it will always pass the request as the first parameter in your function and the response as the second parameter in your function. Now, I've been talking a while, and there's one more thing we got to do just to have our server runnable so that we can then see this, right? And test all of this stuff. And it'll hopefully make a little bit more sense when we're testing it. So I'm just going to comment this one out for now. The last step we need to do after you've created this GET request, right? The last step that we need to do is we need to run our server. So in order to run our server, basically we got to tell the server, hey, is actually a step before we run the server, which is basically telling the server to listen on that particular port that we define. So we define port 3000. Now we just need to tell Express to listen to traffic on port on our port. To do that, we're just going to use another method that's built into Express called listen. And so the code will look a little something like this. App.listen, we're going to pass in that port that we defined up top, and then another function just to say, hey, once this app is listening, we'll know that it's listening. So it's common that we'll console log something to let us know, hey, our application is running. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here, last pause before we run this. Go ahead, make sure you have at least one of these routes defined, and you have your app.listen defined as well. Again, the app.listen is referring back to this port that we defined up top. So you gotta have that port in there for this. You have to have that port using this same variable name. Otherwise, change this to have it defined how you have it. If you've been following along and you're just kind of going off what I got, you should have a port set to something. You should have a route that you just created and this app.listen. And once you have both those things, then just raise your hand because the next step is us just running it. I'm going to change this console log to say our app is listening on port blah, blah, blah. Oh, let me respond to some of these folks on the chat. Cool. If you have a question, please drop it in the chat. Otherwise, all I'm asking y'all to do is just add these 2 lines of code to your particular file, and we should be good to go. Cool. And then I'll share this code in Slack. So if you didn't get a chance to follow along, you'll have it in the Slack. Awesome. So now that we've told, let's just recap what we've done, and then we're going to run this to see it working. So first, we imported Express into our project, right? We used the Express package. In order to get the Express package, we had to install it to our particular package, to our packages. So we used npm install Express to get this Express package. That allowed us to import it into our project like so. Next, we created a new app that is using Express. And so we just did that by creating a variable called app that is holding the result of this Express application function, which basically this Express function does a lot for us in terms of just setting our app up to be able to use a number of different pre-built Express functions and in order to get our server running. The next thing we need to do whenever you're building an Express application is define the port that your server is going to run on. Port 3000 is common, but either way, you kind of just set it to a particular variable. Sometimes you'll see folks set it to the variable like we did, or you'll see people just kind of just loosely define it later. It's just helpful to have it in a variable because it makes it easy to change in case you reference it later. The last thing we had to do before we were, the last couple things we had to do was we created a route, right? A route essentially is what Express will be listening to from the client, right? So remember, our goal was to create something that was going to listen for client requests and respond with data, right? That's exactly what this route does. The first thing the route specifies is what am I listening for from the client, right? And that will be a particular request at a particular path. This is, in this case, the path is the root path, and it's a GET request. Whenever you create a route, you're going to say, hey, based on that particular path and the request that was triggered from the client, I'm going to call a particular function to handle the request and send back a response, right? So in our case, what we're doing here is we're sending back a very simple string of data to our client in response to that request. So that's what our route is doing here. The last thing we need in order to run our app is to tell Express, all right, go ahead and start listening to traffic on our particular port. This command basically starts running Express. This function that is defined here is just kind of like a, hey, once the app starts listening, it gives us a helpful kind of message in the console, so we know, hey, Express is working. So if that makes sense, please raise your hand. And if you're at this point, just if you got this far in the code, just raise your hand. If this makes sense, give me a thumbs up though, just so that I know that that y'all are tracking kind of at least the concepts. And again, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. Awesome, cool. Thank y'all. Appreciate seeing that. So our last step is to run this, right? So now that we have this, my friends, is all you need to create a server using Express. So what we're going to do now is just run the server and play with it to see if it's working. So to do that, first I got to save my file because I hadn't saved it. So all that information is saved. Now, what we want to do is we want to start our server. So any Node project, you can use Node to run any JavaScript file, right? Any file that you have that has a .js on it, you can use Node to run it. To run this particular file, our index.js, we're going to use Node, and we're going to say index.js. So Node index.js should run our JavaScript file. It's going to execute our JavaScript file. And as you can see, as soon as I sent this, we got a little console message that says our app is listening on port 3000. That is the result of this listen message function here, which is why we had this listen in here with a particular function so that it was clear, okay, now we're listening. So Now that we see this says our app is listed on port 3000, right? You can see that the terminal is kind of, I would say lagging. It's just kind of holding, right? It's still running something, right? That means that our server is up and running, right? The server is running, so the terminal is kind of held up on the process of holding our server. So now, if I were to go back to a browser, right? So I'm just going to go to a browser, and in the browser, I'm going to navigate to localhost colon 3000, and I should see, hey, hello world, we're live on our first server, right? Which is that route, the response from that route that I just created. So go ahead and do that on your side, right? Run the application. I'll recap how to do that in a second. And go to your browser, and if you see it running on your side, just raise your hand so I know that you got that. While y'all do that, I'm going to recap how to do that, right? So go back to your terminal, and all you need to do is you need to run your index.js file. So to do that, you say node space index.js. Again, you can use node with any name file. So if your file was called app.js or server.js, this would still be the same. You just would change the name of the file. And then you should see some confirmation if you followed the code that I followed and you have at least a console log message in your app.listen. If you didn't put like this console.log and you just did app.listen, it might be working, but you don't really have something to show you, hey, it's working. So there you go on that side. So if that makes sense, and you guys got it running, just raise your hand so I know that we're at the same place. And yeah, and we'll talk about what we go from here. So just to recap again, if you go back to your browser, you'll see that you should see that your server is running on that particular route. Now, seeing that everybody has something kind of showing up, let's talk about what we do next. What happens next from here, right? Well, the reality is that now we can define new routes for ourselves, right? These new routes are going to be kind of the essence of our application. These new routes are going to be the essence of our application. So we're going to be able to create as many routes that work for what we want this app to do. So remember earlier, I started out building a little test route. So I'm going to go ahead and just add that back. So remember, a route basically has to specify two things. The first thing is, what is the type of request it's listening for? And what is the path of that request in the browser or from the client? After I've defined those two things, it's my responsibility to say, well, when this route gets listened to, what am I supposed to do, right? If I want the app to work as to its best degree, it will be good for me to make sure that I respond with some data. So in this case, I'm going to do another response. I'm going to just do res.send. And again, now you can see too, there's a couple different things you can send. You could just send data. You could send a file. You could send a status code. You could send just a date. The send is by far the most flexible. So I'm just going to say res.send. And in this case, I'm going to send back a string, but I'm going to send, as you can see, if we look back at the send, right? We can send a lot of different types of data. One type that is common is JSON data, and JSON data is common because if we sent that data back, we could run it in our JavaScript application. As you can see on this line down here, we could send some HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and try that and send some HTML. So I'm just going to go ahead, send an HTML tag first, just kind of playing around with this idea here. And inside of the HTML tag, remember, well, what goes in an HTML tag? Well, we have inside of the HTML tag, we have the body, right? And the head. So I'm just going to go ahead, put a body, and in the body, you got to close the body. It's not the easiest to write this in one line like this. So got the body, but I'm going to inside of there, just put a little H1 and say testing, sending HTML. And then I got to close the H1 And cool. So got an HTML document, body, inside of the body, a little H1. So let's see if this will work if I sent this back as a test. Either way, the route itself is good, right? It's just a route that's going to say, hey, if you go to /test on my server, I'm going to respond with something. In this case, I'm choosing instead of responding with just some data in a string, I'm going to just respond with an actual HTML document. So running this, I'm going to go back to the browser and just go to /test. And oh, that's my bad. So that actually brings up a good point. Why am I getting this error? Cannot get /test. Well, the issue is this. If I change up any of the routes on the server that's currently running doesn't have the last bit of changes on its running instance. So to fix this, I'm going to stop the server. So to stop the server inside of your terminal, you're just going to want to do Control-C. Control-C will kill the server. Once that server is stopped, then I can run node index again to relaunch the server. And when the server is relaunched, all my routes should be updated. And now you can see that when I do the test, I'm actually getting some a whole HTML document in there. What's important to note is the way that all of this works is through networking, right? We're sending requests to our little server. So let me just show y'all this one time, right? If I refresh here, if I refresh, go to all, yeah, you can see here we're making a request to the test route. You see that this is showing the name of the route and it's showing the response. And that response is clearly some HTML, right? We can see the request URL was made to our server running localhost on 3000. It was a GET request and it came back with that particular response. So clearly the responses are coming back and they're being translated into HTML for us as well. So if I were to go back to the regular route and look at the same thing, right? We can see, hey, I made a request to localhost and the response was this little string. If I look at the elements, you can see that the elements are also, it's being put into our HTML already as a part of our body, right? Don't mind these scripts. These are just things from some Chrome extensions I have. But if you look, you can see that that response is triggering us with some HTML. When we link back up, we're going to keep exploring this concept of we're sending basically back HTML and talk about, well, how do we go from what we've been doing, which is building these really complex HTML applications using React and JavaScript, et cetera, to being able to, with our server, create those applications and send those applications back when someone goes to a particular running instance of our server. But for right now, congratulations. If you followed me this far, you've built your first server. You might have a couple different routes if you added a different route just now. But now you know how to set up a server with Express. Anytime somebody asks you if you can work with Express to set up servers, now you can say yes. So congratulations to y'all. And with that, I will stop the stream. I'll see y'all in a couple of days. Hang back if you have some questions. And if not, have a great night.